Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 10 hidden gems for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about players at a variety of different positions, players that you would consider to be sleeper options going into Week 10. I just like to call them hidden gems. These are players that are scattered across the fantasy football landscape and universe that currently have low start percentages. Some players as low as 4%, some in the 20-30% range, some as high as 50%. But these are players that just aren't getting enough love going into Week 10, despite the fact that many of us are dealing with injuries on our rosters, and of course, 4 major teams on bye week with the Kansas City Chiefs, Los Angeles Rams, Miami Dolphins, and Philadelphia Eagles. So I'll go ahead, talk about each of these individual hidden gems, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each of these individual players, while also presenting statistics as to why I believe they're startable options that can help us lead to victories in Week 10. Before we get into today's video, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. If you're looking for a specific player, of course, it's going to be players that you're not really expecting, but nonetheless, you know that Calvin Ridley's on the thumbnail for sure. Outside of that, for those of you guys who were wondering, at the end of today's episode, I'll be putting together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy. So for those of you who haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out the link. When you go ahead and travel on over, use code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get the first time deposit match up to $100, you'll also receive an email every single Sunday morning from me directly to you with my rankings for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR rankings by tier, all-encompassing rankings. So regardless of what you're doing on Sunday mornings, you have an advantage upon your league mates. Be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. Draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy, and of course, participate with us this upcoming weekend in regards to some pick'em slips that we'll be putting together. I've been on fire as of late, so we're going to continue that streak going into this upcoming weekend of Week 10. Thank you very much for the support. Now let's get into talking about some hidden gems, beginning with our number one, or I guess the number one would be the Soul Stone for this week. It's Noah Brown. The Soul Stone, like we all know, requires a sacrifice. Therefore, going into this week, unfortunately, the sacrifice will be Dameon Pierce and Nico Collins, both starting options within this offense that unfortunately are out due to injury. Of course, Nico Collins played last week, was able to score a touchdown within this offense, but unfortunately going into this week is going to be out. So the return of Robert Woods isn't going to remove Noah Brown within this overall rotation, but in fact, give him more opportunity to flourish within this offense, which we obviously saw him do last week. Last week, Week 9, against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, had himself 6 targets, 6 receptions, 153 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 24.3 fantasy points, still being outshined by Tank Dell within that offense in terms of overall fantasy point contribution, but nonetheless, an incredible game. Last week, he played 72% of the overall offensive snaps. That led to 52 overall snaps in general. Of those 52 snaps that he played, 68% of them were within the slot position. He was the primary slot wide receiver. And going into this week with the return of Robert Woods, the expectation is that Noah Brown will continue to stay and maintain that role. Now, the primary reason why I wanted to mention that is because of the matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals are allowing 24.76 half PPR fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average. That's not a high number, especially considering how much upside this receiving core has already demonstrated over the course of the season, especially when they get into those pass-happy, game scripts overall, like last week. But they're allowing 160 receiving yards per game. If in fact, the receiving core of the Houston Texans were only to put up that number, it would be quite disappointing this week. But I expect them to be able to exceed that, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals this week. Now, the primary reason I wanted to mention the matchup in general is because if in fact we continue to see Noah Brown play in the slot position 68 to 70% of the time, he'll be taking on Mike Hilton. Mike Hilton in seasons past for the Cincinnati Bengals and or the Pittsburgh Steelers was a feared cornerback within the nickel position. As of late, over the course of this season, has been quite disappointing, to be honest. Over the course of this season, he has allowed the 16th most receptions to slot receiving options, and on top of that, the 13th most yards to opposing slot receiving options. My expectation for this week is that Noah Brown, within the matchup, within his overall role within this offense, and the pass-happy game script that will most likely be in line. Like I mentioned with this offense very often, with CJ Stroud and a lack of a running game, they're going to have to continue to pass the ball. And now that they have a healthy offensive line, like they've demonstrated over the course of the last couple weeks, they can protect this quarterback. Sam Hubbard, one of the primary starting defensive ends for this team, is not going to be active. That's going to allow more time for a guy like CJ Stroud to sit in the pocket and absolutely dominate. Now, I've talked about this offense being like pass happy, but when you go ahead and look at the overall metrics in terms of passing attempts versus rushing attempts over the course of the season, they only have a 58.2% passing rate. That's number 17 amongst all teams in the National Football League, relatively low. But when you look at last weekend's game, 42 passing attempts, 17 rushing attempts, that's a 72% passing rate. That's as high as teams like the Minnesota Vikings, which lead the National Football League within that overall category over the entirety of the season. When this team wants to go ahead and heavily pass the ball, which they'll probably go ahead and do, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, considering Devin Singletary isn't much of a force within the running game, we should see a lot of upside within the receiving core and hopefully Noah Brown for this week. Moving on to the reality stone, because the reality of the situation going into this week is that Kyler Murray is finally back for the Arizona Cardinals. Coming off of the ACL injury from last season, obviously rehab through that entire thing, was on the PUP list, the physically unable to perform list for the first 2 months of the season, and now has the availability to come back and bring some life into this offense. Of course, Joshua Dobbs did a great job with all of the receiving options, but I believe there's even more upside to be achieved by the receiving options of the Arizona Cardinals, whether that be a Marquise Hollywood Brown, of course, Michael Wilson, James Conner out of the backfield, but of course, the player we want to talk about, Trey McBride. Trey McBride, the second-year tight end, obviously in the absence of Zach Ertz, has seen himself a lot of opportunity. Over the course of the season, the Cardinals tight ends have had themselves a lot of opportunity, whether it has been Trey McBride or when Zach Ertz was healthy. Thus far this season, Arizona tight ends on a per-game basis have been given 9.8 targets per game, 6.6 receptions, 56 receiving yards, and 0.22 receiving touchdowns per game. That's 10.21 fantasy points per game on average. Now, when you go back to last season with a different offensive coordinator, but with Kyler Murray, in the town healthy games that he played, he was able to get those tight ends heavily utilized. 7.5 targets, 5.1 receptions, 42.1 receiving yards, 0.4 receiving touchdowns, and 9.56 fantasy points per game. Going forward, Trey McBride has a huge opportunity for upside, especially within the matchup, taking on the Atlanta Falcons in the first week of return from Kyler Murray as a potential, security blanket within this offense. The Atlanta Falcons are allowing 10.27 fantasy points per game. That's the 13th most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing tight ends thus far this season on average. But when you go ahead and isolate the overall statistics in which this defense has allowed, they have allowed the second most targets to tight ends, 74. Again, a lot of teams want to go ahead and heavily utilize their tight ends against the Atlanta Falcons. Not really a surprise. They found a lot of success. They've also allowed the third most receptions to opposing tight ends, 55 total, the 13th most receiving yards to opposing tight ends, 469, and the 12th most receiving touchdowns to opposing tight ends, 3 thus far this season. That has been the biggest difference maker. Otherwise, they should be allowing far more fantasy points per game based on the volume of targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Touchdowns been the biggest factor. If in fact we don't expect Trey McBride to score a touchdown, he is still going to be a relevant option based on the volume of targets that he is going to get within the given week. I mean, it was just a couple weeks back with a solid quarterback not named Clayton Tune, with Josh Dobbs was able to get himself 14 targets, over 10 plus receptions, and have a dominant performance within the overall week. My expectation with Kyler Murray returning is that Trey McBride takes the next step as a solid tight end option for this week. Moving on to the power stone. The power back of this week is Tyler Allgeier. I'm sure no one was expecting Tyler Allgeier to be on today's episode, especially considering he has a 27% start percentage. Only people who are desperate enough and in a very tough bind really will start Tyler Allgeier going in this week. And I want to admit that first and foremost. You really have to be in a tough bind. But in the last 4 games, Tyler Allgeier, with Bijan Robinson healthy, I'm not going to include the game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in which Bijan Robinson obviously was dealing with a little bit of an injury in that game with the migraine. In the last 4 healthy games with Bijan, Tyler Allgeier is averaging 12.5 rushing attempts per game, a 3.22 yard per carry average, and only 40 rushing yards per game. And you may be thinking, Andrew, why would we want to start a running back of that caliber? Well, if you go back to last week against the Minnesota Vikings, a great defense overall, we still saw Tyler Allgeier have 12 rushing attempts, 39 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 targets, 2 receptions, and was able to get himself 10 fantasy points throughout the overall week. My expectation going forward is that we'll continue to see a lot of Tyler Allgeier within this offense. I mean, just looking at what the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons has committed to, Arthur Smith wants to get more opportunities to guys like Jonnu Smith than Kyle Pitts. He's continuing to give more opportunities and touches within a given week, like last week, to Allgeier in comparison to Bijan Robinson, who's been far more efficient. So we're not going to be able to really argue with what the coaching staff is doing. If the coach is going to play it as such, we have to adapt to it. That's how fantasy football works. So going into this week, with Tyler Allgeier leading the backfield in terms of red zone rushing attempts, 25 in his direction in comparison to Bijan Robinson within the red zone, only having 9 rushing attempts. When you take it another step further, within the 10-yard line, Tyler Allgeier had 10 rushing attempts for 3 rushing touchdowns. Bijan Robinson only has 2 rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line this season for 0 rushing touchdowns. And with Taylor Heinicke taking over the quarterback position, in comparison to Desmond Ridder, I mean, last week and the week before, Taylor Heinicke had 0 designed rushing attempts. They're not going to utilize him in the same capacity in which they did with Desmond Ridder, who was obviously a fumble machine, would have probably led to far more touchdowns from Tyler Allgeier. But nonetheless, the opportunities are absolutely going to be there when you take on the Arizona Cardinals, a defense that is allowing over 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, the 6th best matchup at the position in terms of running back rushing statistics. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, allowing 4.46 yards per carry on average over the course of this season. I expect that Tyler Allgeier will be given his 10 plus potential, 12 rushing attempt opportunities. And when he does, he'll be far more efficient this week. And if they get down into the red zone in any sort of capacity, I'm expecting the opportunities to go in his direction and for him to potentially find himself within the end zone. Moving on to the space zone, and the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is currently being started in 62% of leagues in comparison to Allgeier, who is at 27, Trey McBride 32, and Noah Brown at 4%. Obviously, it's a huge difference maker here, but nonetheless, I just felt like he wasn't getting enough love going into this week. Taking on the San Francisco 49ers should be an easy matchup overall. I mean, besides the fact that it is the 6th best matchup at the position and they're allowing nearly 32 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Going into this week without Zay Jones active, obviously missing another consecutive game, you got to remember that Calvin Ridley in 3 of the last 4 games he has played has been able to get himself 8+ targets. And with no Zay Jones there and Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley being the primary number 1 and 2 option within the overall matchup, a defense that is allowing 32 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, my expectation would be a lot of upside here from Calvin Ridley. The last 2 games alone, the San Francisco 49ers have given up 235 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 21 receptions to Cincinnati Bengals wide receivers, and 241 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 17 receptions to Minnesota Vikings wide receivers. We have seen that this secondary has struggled mightily, whether it is against Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd, and or guys like Jordan Addison. It doesn't matter across the board, whether they're elite players or average players, they have given up a lot of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So my expectation going into this week is higher upside for Calvin Ridley. And hopefully going into this week can find his upside and be the space stone of week 10. Now, a couple other stats that I wanted to mention in regards to what gives me confidence in starting Calvin Ridley. We know that most recently, prior to the bye week for the Jacksonville Jaguars and 49ers, who both experienced that bye week in week 9, throughout that week, we did obviously see the trade of Chase Young going to the San Francisco 49ers. That's a big deal there. We know that the Jacksonville Jaguars have taken on defenses that have great pass rushers. The last time we saw the Jacksonville Jaguars play football against the Pittsburgh Steelers, TJ Watt and Highsmith there are no joke in terms of defensive ends and in terms of a pass rush. In that matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 10 targets, 6 catches, 83 yards. That's something to build on, and going forward, hopefully the momentum continues for Calvin Ridley. Over the course of the season, when Trevor Lawrence has been under pressure, Calvin Ridley leads the Jacksonville Jaguars in terms of the highest target share with 24% amongst all receiving options within this offense. On top of that, over the course of this season, in the 4 highest games in which Trevor Lawrence was pressured in terms of overall percentages, on all of those overall games, Calvin Ridley has been able to get himself 7 or more targets. As long as we continue to see pressure go in the direction of Trevor Lawrence, I'm not worried about the potential of Calvin Ridley making plays down the field, because many would think, well, if Joey Bosa and Chase Young are getting after this quarterback, he's going to have to get the ball out of his hands very quickly to guys like Evan Ingram and, of course, Christian Kirk, and that could absolutely be the case. But we have seen in the games in which Trevor Lawrence has been pressured heavily over the course of the season, he has still been able to find time and execute plays and get the ball in the direction, 7+ times per game to Calvin Ridley in those overall instances. I'm not worried about him. I think there's going to be a lot of potential within the matchup and against the secondary that has been exposed as of late for Calvin Ridley to absolutely be a potential wide receiver that can help you capture a victory and a hidden gem for week 10. Moving on to this time stone. Now that Joshua Dobbs has time to learn this playbook and is going to be given first team snaps, which he didn't experience at all last week, he's going to be a dominant force for the Minnesota Vikings in the absence of Kirk Cousins. Now, if you go back to week 8 with the Arizona Cardinals, Joshua Dobbs took on the Baltimore Ravens defense, an elite defense and one that has played extremely well all season long. In that game, Joshua Dobbs, 25 of 37 passing, a 67.6% passing completion percentage, 200 passing yards, 2 touchdowns through the air, 2 interceptions, that's fine, but 6 rushing attempts for 26 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 22.92 fantasy points. That was the final game that he played for the Arizona Cardinals. In Week 9 against the Atlanta Falcons, after barely learning the offense and getting 0 practice reps with the offensive first team, he was able to play against the Atlanta Falcons, have himself a game in which he had a 66.7% passing completion percentage, 20 of 30 passing, 158 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 7 rushing attempts for 66 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, and even more fantasy points, 24.92. This last week. He's most recently been able to play against elite defenses like the Baltimore Ravens and find success. He's been able to play against defenses like the Atlanta Falcons with literally 0 experience within the offense and still be the number 4 overall quarterback within that given week. Obviously due to the rushing upside, but nonetheless also had 2 passing touchdowns. And I understand his overall average depth of target last week, 6.6 yards, very low. On top of the fact that his overall yards per attempt was 5.3, those are low numbers, but understand he literally didn't even know the route concepts that were being ran within this offense. My expectation going into this week is a lot of upside for Joshua Dobbs within this offense. With KJ Osborne having fully practiced on Friday, he'll be ready to go. With Christian Darrisaw, the primary starting left tackle, all-pro left tackle of the Minnesota Vikings, full practice on Friday, back from last week, obviously wasn't there last week. A lot of the pressure was coming from the Joshua Dobbs blind side, was able to escape from the pocket due to his rushing upside, but now that he has his offensive line healthy, he gets a receiver back. TJ Hawkinson is expected to play despite being questionable and limited practices all week. There is also the potential for upside for Justin Jefferson to return. Justin Jefferson wasn't deemed out this week. He's still questionable and had a full week of limited participation. If, in fact, we're going to be in a situation where Justin Jefferson is outright not going to play, they would have deemed him as doubtful or potentially even out already. But the fact that he's questionable gives me the indication that perhaps the Minnesota Vikings, their coaching staff, they're not telling us as much as they actually know. And maybe there's an opportunity this week for Justin Jefferson to play, which would only increase Joshua Dobbs in his overall potential. Only starting in 32% of leagues with time under his belt and more opportunities to learn this offense, his upside continues to grow within the given week against the New Orleans Saints. Moving on to the final hidden gem for this week, we have George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. George Pickens, wide receiver, currently starting in 54% of leagues. Last week, obviously, was quite underwhelming. 2 receptions for -1 receiving yards, as bad as it could possibly get. Obviously had an opportunity of scoring a receiving touchdown, wasn't able to bring down that second foot. Nonetheless, after the Thursday Night Football game against the Tennessee Titans, in which the Pittsburgh Steelers won, no thanks to the overall efforts of George Pickens, but later that night he went to Twitter, or X, and he tweeted, "Free me." And in that overall kind of, statement, he's basically saying, get me out of Pittsburgh because Kenny Pickett sucks. And I don't blame him. Kenny Pickett has missed him on a lot of opportunities over the course of this season and seasons past. But the entire situation really is, in my opinion, a squeaky wheel gets the oil or grease. He's going to continue to complain until he gets his opportunities. And once, in fact, he gets his opportunities going into this week against the Green Bay Packers, he'll no longer complain. This is just how the wide receiver position works. I mean, you go back to week 2 of this season, A.J. Brown throwing a tantrum on the sideline. After that, he breaks the record for the most consecutive games of over 125 receiving yards by an NFL wide receiver. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. And that's my expectation going into this week in regards to the Mind Stone. I'm expecting George Pickens taking on the Green Bay Packers, who literally do not have a starting secondary intact going into this week. Jair Alexander, their primary cornerback, doubtful. You might as well just serve him as out, because doubtful pretty much means out over the course of this season. On top of that, Eric Stokes, another one of the starting cornerbacks, on the IR. Rasul Douglas traded last week. Darnell Savage, one of the starting safeties, out on the injured reserve. Rudy Ford, who didn't play last week and is a backup who is filling in for Darnell Savage, was limited all week at practice and is questionable to play. There is a very good chance that every single member of the starting secondary of this defense is going to be out. On top of the fact that Quay Walker, one of their starting linebackers, is doubtful to play, this secondary, this defense for the Green Bay Packers is in trouble. I'm expecting George Pickens to get back on track. It was just a couple weeks back against the LA Rams in which he put up a great performance, even with Deontay Johnson on the field. the squeaky wheel gets its oil. I'm expecting him to have himself a great overall performance within the given week. All right, that's going to cover it for my hidden gems for week 10. I want to go ahead and review week 9's overall hidden gems. Then I'll go ahead and put together some pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy. So let's go ahead and let's talk about last week. Demario Douglas, amongst all receiving options, unfortunately was only wide receiver 31. Still a top 36 option and a startable option in that overall capacity if you play in a league in which you have 3 wide receivers starting and 12 teams, which based on the fantasy football landscape is the norm as of late. Brandon Cooks, unfortunately, wide receiver 96. My goodness, was that a whiff. Obviously, Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks, nowhere to be found. Turpin and Tolbert were the guys scoring touchdowns. I think the outcome of the overall situation wasn't great, but I think the strategy of playing a wide receiver that was getting himself constant utilization within this offense against the best matchup at the position was sound. Unfortunately, the outcome just didn't, live up to the overall expectation. And other wide receivers, 4th and 5th string wide receivers in this offense scored the touchdowns instead of Brandon Cooks, no problem. Chuba Hubbard last week, RB24, a solid overall option, top 24, a startable player in his overall contribution. Jahan Dotson was the best of the bunch. Wide receiver 9 was able to score himself another touchdown. Fantastic. CJ Stroud, guys, I did not expect CJ Stroud to get himself 40 plus fantasy points. Hey, but we'll take it. Hidden gem of the week. And Arizona Cardinals defense, I really did trust the spinning wheel, and the spinning wheel betrayed me. I'll go ahead and give you an update as to how that spinning wheel is going to pay out on Sunday, once in fact my brother figures out what defense he is playing going into this week. I'm fairly certain, if I'm not mistaken, he picked up the Las Vegas Raiders defense off of our waivers, so we'll have to keep that monitored either way. All right, let's get into putting together some pick'em slips. A reminder, if you go ahead and sign up before Sunday as a new customer special, you'll go ahead and take advantage of Garrett Wilson 0.5 total yards. Speaking of Garrett Wilson, for those of you who have already signed up in the past and can't take advantage of this overall new customer special, I have a couple plays in regards to Garrett Wilson that I want to take advantage of going into this week. So let's go ahead and talk about that right now. So let's go ahead and begin by talking about Garrett Wilson. His current number of targets is 9.5. I believe he'll very easily be able to surpass this. He's been able to get himself 12 or more targets in 4 of the last 5 games he has played. They take on the Las Vegas Raiders defense this week. I'm expecting the targets to continue to be consistent going in his direction. All he needs to do is get himself 10 or more targets. He should very easily be able to accomplish that. Now, if you don't want to roll the targets, you can also run his receiving yards. He's been able to surpass 66.5 receiving yards in each of the last 3 games that he has participated in, obviously because of the high overall target share that he's getting within this offense. Both of those overall plays are fantastic for him this week. I wouldn't take any risk on touchdown, considering he hasn't scored a touchdown in since week 2, but nonetheless, a great overall option, whether it's receiving yards and or targets going into this week. Now, staying on the topic of targets, I want to talk about Dalton Kincaid going into this week. 6 targets is not enough. He's been able to accomplish that in 3 of the last 3 games. They take on the 3rd best matchup going into the given week. My expectation, he should very easily be able to surpass this number. In the last 3 games, has had 7, 8, and 11 targets at the tight end position. I'm expecting him to get another high utilization game and very easily should be able to surpass 6 overall targets. All he needs to do is maintain 7. Now, the next player I wanted to talk about, also a tight end, but I also want to continue the conversation of targets. Again, opportunity leads to success in fantasy football, and we've witnessed that with TJ Hawkinson. 7 targets is not enough. TJ Hawkinson, regardless of who's been at quarterback, Kirk Cousins and or Joshua Dobbs last week, he has been able to surpass 8 or more targets in 13 of the last 14 games he has played for the Minnesota Vikings, including the NFL playoffs. So with that being taken into account, I think this is another one of these smash plays. If you want to go ahead and put together a pick'em slip with all 3 of these players in terms of targets, I don't think that's a bad idea at all. Now, continuing on, I wanted to mention a couple more players. Gabe Davis. Like I mentioned earlier this week, Gabe Davis at home in comparison to on the road is a completely different player over the course of this season. His current number is 38.5 receiving yards. Thus far this season at home, he's been able to accomplish that in 4 of the last 5 games he has played by a significant margin, surpassing that number by a considerable amount. On the road this season, he's 0 for 4, has not been able to surpass that number a single time. Therefore, at home this week against the Denver Broncos, I'm expecting this to be another one of these Gabe Davis games, be able to fire him up in regards to either receptions or receiving yardage, maybe even a touchdown. That may not be a bad overall play. 1.75x could end up swaying you in the right direction, considering he does score a lot of touchdowns at home over the course of the season. One of the final players I wanted to mention is DK Metcalf. 66.5 receiving yards should easily be able to be accomplished, taking on the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position. The Washington Commanders have not stopped a soul within the receiving game. My expectation is a big week and a bounce back week here, especially considering DK Metcalf only had 1 reception last week for 50 receiving yards. And if we take into account the fact that he's been able to surpass this number in 4 of the last 6 games he has played, my expectation is that DK Metcalf should very easily be able to accomplish this against the secondary that has been struggling all season long. Again, you should be trading for DK Metcalf because the back end of the season, weeks 14 through 17, it's a green streak of success in terms of the most advantageous streak of games going into the fantasy football playoffs. Last, but definitely not least, I wanted to mention Amon-Ra St. Brown. His current number of receiving yards is at 83.5. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been able to surpass 100 receiving yards in 5 of the last 6 games. Just putting it out there, I'm not going to add it to the slip because I've already put together a 5-player slip with the 5 other players that I've mentioned, and I'll go ahead and I'll send that through. But this is a little bit of the honorable mention that I wanted to go ahead and present to you guys, just in case if you're looking for another play potentially going into this week. Now, in regards to last night's play, I suggested these 4 players. I did suggest Adam Thielen in terms of overall receptions. I took him in receiving yards. Either way, he wasn't able to accomplish either of those, overall numbers, but I was able to put together a couple plays here. I took my 2 favorite players, put them within an overall slip, was able to do well there. I also was able to put, Giannis with them, considering I saw this flash play pop up. This was also another, pretty decent play for me. So we'll take that. I mean, overall, again, I'm just trying to put together as many slips as possible. So if one of these falls apart like Adam Thielen did for me, I still have my 2 favorite plays within an overall slip kind of contributing to the right direction. Either way, those were the results of last night. 3 for 4 in terms of my overall proclamations, but nonetheless, a pretty decent overall week. Hopefully, we'll continue that streak of success going into this weekend. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back tomorrow, Saturday afternoon, 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be live streaming here on the channel, answering questions. Sunday morning, 4-hour live stream for the final time this upcoming weekend. Because, of course, the Germany game starting at 6:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be live streaming for 4 straight hours starting at 6 a.m. PST. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll see you then. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.